Hello, everyone. I am Divya Jindal, your host for the session today. And on behalf of the Building Accessible, Safe, and Inclusive Indian Cities program at NIUA, I extend a very warm welcome to all of you for the lecture series Think Urban, Think Inclusive. This is an 8-part lecture series themed Think Urban, Think Inclusive, where we shall discuss approaches for making Indian cities more accessible, safe, and inclusive for all. The series is designed as a discussion with key sector experts and change makers, leaders to focus and collectively think and discuss ways and tools to improve lives and empower persons with disability, elderly and young children and their caregivers living in urban areas through various pertinent subjects and concerns in the domain. Before we begin, I'll just give you a couple of housekeeping points. This is a pre-recorded event. The platform has a delay of around 10 seconds. So while recording, depending on the internet connection, you may experience some latency in audio and video. The entire lecture will have closed captioning included at the bottom of this recording. The session is designed as in a concise format with short introduction, setting up of the context, 15 to 18 minutes presentation by the presenter and a round of questions and answers. If you're watching this on YouTube, we encourage you to use the comment section to leave your feedback and post questions. Today, we are joined by Mr. Harpreet Singh Arora. Welcome, Harpreet. For the benefit of our audience, let me take a minute here to introduce our speaker today. Harpreet has more than 18 years of experience as an urban development specialist. His experience includes delivering assignments in urban and regional policy planning, econometric modeling for large infrastructure projects, and real estate assets monetization and amortization strategies. Harpreet has worked extensively with Indian cities in bringing transformational change and adapting progressive urban services, delivery reforms mandated under federal government since past 10 years. Scaling up the agenda for inclusion and community participation in making cities work for prosperity are his keen areas of interest that he would like to work on in the coming years. Today, he'll be talking to us on the topic, making real estate markets work for inclusive development. I'll just quickly give a short brief about this topic. We all know that real estate market is one of the most globally recognized sectors contributing to the national economy and the job generation. Real estate sector in India is expected to reach a market size of almost $1 trillion by 2030 from 120 billion US dollars in 2017 and contribute to around 13% of country's GDP by 2025. However, owning a home or having a home is more than just an address. For persons with disabilities, their concerns include not only good neighborhood and location, but also safety, affordability, and accessibility. The government missions in India, such as Smart Cities Mission and Accessible India Mission, offer a great opportunity to ensure inclusion and participation of persons with disability in workplace, neighborhood, and activities in social life. The aim of these missions and programs is to protect persons with disability from housing discrimination and to bolster the availability of accessible dwellings. There is still, however, no current coherent policy to address the housing needs for persons with disability. Accessible homes are undersupplied, even if assume that these are being occupied by households with a person who is disabled. In reality, the situation is made worse by the fact that accessible homes and persons with disability are rarely paired together. The lecture today discusses methods which may efficiently deliver financial and social models to cater to this need-based and housing market segment and subsequently strengthen the existing government programs and initiatives. On that note, I would like to invite Mr. Arora to share his insights and his presentation on the subject. Welcome, Mr. Harpreet.
Thank you, Divya. Thanks, Veronica. Thanks for that introduction and setting this conversation. We've got a slideshow. Would you project it or should I project it from my side?
Do you want to share it?
Sure. Let me do that. I think that'll be faster. Can you see it now? Thank you. Can you confirm if you can see the slideshow?
Yes, I can. We can.
Okay, great. So let me just put this on the slideshow mode and see if you can see it all. Great. Thanks, Divya. I'll just go right into it. And thanks for defining the statement that how real estate can contribute and is also one of the biggest defining spaces for which contribute both for economy and then how underserving it is for people with disability. Uh, we're going to be specifically talking about a residential real estate or the real estate around housing. And then we just begin from establishing the need. Uh, so inclusive housing, as we all say, whether that is high rise or whether that's for plotted development, it, 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 apart from people with disability, it actually has a universal appeal. Whether you're young, whether you're tall, whether you're short, having inclusive housing does has a universal appeal. Homes that are convenient and comfortable, they attract everyone. And then whether you are rich or whether you're looking for an affordable housing, that's one of the areas that we want to look and deliver work for. And an estimate of about 8 million people who are people with disability residents, and then there's a demand for about 80 million households for people who are below the age of 60. And then if you compare that with countries like UK or with Australia or others, this number is actually larger in context of other countries because India still is more a population base between 15 to 60. So this number is today less, but in maybe another 3 or 4 decades, this number is going to grow. So, and we all know that in the last about 10 to 15 years, there's a nationwide push on universal home ownership. And that's why we found a government's actually investing a lot in promoting affordable housing, both in the urban sector as well as in the rural sector. But I felt that there's not enough attention that's being given to the disability-led market demand, whether that's for the new supply that's being constructed under the housing markets, or that's coming from even the retrofitting of the existing ones. So we possibly are in the point where we might want to widen the narrative of what is the market size, and then talking from the perspective of international property consultants or transaction advisors, or even people who fund housing projects, which are banks or the funding housing, non-banking housing financial agencies. The the widening of this would mean people with disability, people with the aging population, and care-seeking groups. And those could be people which may grow up to not have any disability and not being cared for. But this is expansion. So by 2018, about 64% of urban households had their own dwelling unit, and about 1/3 of those were living in rented accommodation. Uh, and then the residential real estate, in the Indian context, uh, just by a benchmark, but 20 million affordable houses is the supply paradox that we see by 2022. And it's a huge supply, it's coming in tier 2 cities and tier 1 cities, and then it's actually backed by both federal agencies and then also by the state governments promoting the idea of universal home ownership. But the paradox here is that there is a vacancy, about a vacancy of 11 million homes which are unoccupied. So, and the reason why I quote this is because while we're trying to put up a demand number, We're trying to not bring up what is the existing supply and how that existing supply could be made occupied, so that we rationalize the real demand. And then if I estimate it's about 80 million people who would be below the age of above the age of 60, and then if we would want to emphasize and find out the number, what is the space that would be required to be retrofitted or created, we should have a universal design guidelines and modern assistive technology solutions. An estimate is about 6 million square feet, and if you quote that number to a developer, it's actually a very big appealing market when you start putting up this as a business sense. So the disability accommodation market, or what we call as residential real estate, is actually fragmented, is underfunded, and we all know that the reasons, and we'll come to know about and explore how this could be moved out. And then because of that, there is a result in inflexible markets. So today, you and me would want to go up and look up for a housing accommodation on either one of these websites. You might not find the best funding accommodation, but if you are actually trying to look up with the better tools of funding these projects, you might find an option to find these housing units coming up there. So the gap in the value chain, because we always talk about the demand side, I'm trying to pull this from the supply side. Let's pick it up from the supply side first. It's the absence of compliance and regulatory mechanisms. Let's try to understand. One of the biggest hindrances when someone's going to deliver or retrofit existing buildings for inclusive spaces, the existing building bylaws are not progressive. And even if we talk about them having compliance with universal design guidelines, it's actually a mere certification. But then I think there's more assurance depending upon the size of structure which is required, is need to be progressively stuck in. We all know that, since COVID-19 has stuck in, home and space adjustment plays a vital role in operationalizing inclusion. But the regulatory norms that we are built in today are actually very counterfeiting to that production, because if you would want to alter designs or you want to do additional addressing in the space within the housing or the build structure, you basically have to go through a lot of lengthy ways of delivering work. So you can't predict when you might have a person with disability, or you might have people who might need assistance and alterations in their homes. If you would want to do that, you actually have to go through a lot of scenes of making home changes, and then that would attract a lot of regulatory frameworks to be listed, which is not an easy way to do it. So I think that has to be done more on self-compliance and you can basically make it easier to do that. On a scale larger than that, at a master plan scale, I would say that this approach is in which we actually determine land uses, and find demand analysis. And addressing demand at the master plan has to go beyond what we talk about as mixed use. There is a lot of vacancy, and then within the supply. So the housing markets actually are now working differently. We basically find land, and then lands are usually on the end of suburbs, and the end of suburbs pretend to be the areas for rental housing. But adaptive reuse and interoperability of existing spaces, why can't oversupply of commercial spaces within the cities could be used for housing markets, because there are anyway oversupply of commercial markets, and that interoperability of housing land uses is something that would help people or aging population to actually not move out, which we call as neighborhoods which are much away from the center, and the elder population actually goes away and stays in the suburbs. Actually, this is what communities would actually live more inclusively and to be part of the active community, part of the existing master plan. So I think interoperability of land uses, not just for housing, but actually oversupply use, which could be commercial uses, which could be community uses, which could be put back to housing uses within the center of the city, is one area which the master planning approach should think of. And I think Delhi Master Plan has recently tested some of these, but again, it doesn't allow for plot-based uses to be mixed uses, just higher rental housing to be mixed uses. I think another way of testing is the tenancy. A person with disability, who's actually the 33% of urban housing, which might be not owning an accommodation but renting it. The tenancy is not secured, and I think a lot of work needs to be done to relook at the existing Model Tenancy Act, which actually missed the bridge to gap an assurance on protection of tenants, which could be elder tenants, or which could be people with disability, or it could be caregivers who are actually staying closer to people with disability, or persons who might need support for maybe a long term. And then I think actions here could be seeking state. This could be the federal, this could be coordinators set up by the federal states with the states, in making sure that the tenancy, because the more support that is required here is not just assuring that the value of tenancy, but actually the nature of tenancy. And I think one way which was tested by the Australian government and by the UK government was when the rental housing application. So, today there is a vacancy, and then if we change the vacancy and we bring in rental housing, and then the same rental housing could be then subsidized by exemption around the housing. So it is mandatory that you would find people who would want to go for housing which is inclusive, which also has rent which is assured and subsidized. And then in this case, the homeowners who are actually putting up the house for rent, they would be assured because they are cross-subsidized, either through tax exemptions or either through other exemptions that the government could give in. And this is one way by you could actually bring maturity in the housing market, so that people just don't keep on going and adding more apartments for capital gains, but actually these apartments are put to a use, and then this could be actually helping in reducing the vacancy and putting the higher occupancy in times. There's again the part, there's still mandatory by law that the developers should deliver inclusive housing. But in my conversations with many leading developers, we found that there is more to be done on building capacities for private sector, and not because of their compliance, but it's actually hand-holding them through the building stages, and that also implies for the state actors, for the architects, for the engineers who are working within the town and country planning offices. And that's why where NIUA and basic program comes so crucial in identifying these actors and helping them to realize what these upgraded norms for universal design guidelines could be and how this could be folded. We go next on understanding the gap, and something very similar that I said previously, monitoring. In reality, monitoring harmonized design guidelines can't be just two ways, where the developer and the government actually work on an assurance project. But I think if we could set up, and I've spoken about that in the later part of a mechanism in which communities could be rolled up, and some programs that you tested as well through basic program on actually going and verifying these properties and bringing out the best practices of what could be the best universal design guidance that's tested by one developer and then sharing that right with the others is one platform that we could understand and deliver this work on. There is obviously this conversation about financing of inclusive development, and then I found that uh, we've got to approach this differently, uh, because promoting consumer-driven market, so with you and me who can access finance from a housing company or a bank, we actually find developers that suit us. Uh, but in a very long time, the finance has actually been put up for developers to deliver affordable housing or even inclusive housing. But if you invert that, today people with disabilities or people who need inclusive spaces, they are actually assured for having an insurance-linked mechanism. Suddenly, you find the developers actually treat them as a customer bracket that has not been served for a very long time. For a very long time, the capital finance, when the developers actually have to invest on developing this market. Mostly capital financing in today's term is done through private sector financing. For public sector augmented housing, whether that is rental housing or whether that is, in this case, even shared rental housing or part rent and part ownership housing models, they're not ready to include assistive technologies or smart home device installation as part of the capital financing. And it increases the capital financing, but I think what it does in the long range is actually it opens up that market for people who demand for inclusive spaces. So smart automated home development, that piece of capital financing should be made convenient for developers to access finance. It should not be actually, so you build a building for 1,200 rupees or 1,500 rupees a square foot. But if you have to actually make assistive technology or home installation, that doesn't becomes part of the cap financing. So if you do that, your market actually expanding. Promoting occupancy, specifically for PWD and caregivers, can be done through rental contracts. And I think some of the good practices that was seen about 20 years back when the markets actually went back in the US, there were special rights for senior citizens and PWD living on rental contracts. And then, so property owners can actually appeal for tax abatement. And that's something that we could promote that today as well. And this would be encouraging both for better spaces and longer occupancy, and encourage owners to inclusion better spaces. On the discounting of operational expenses to sustain inclusion, we all know that federal financing or guarantees in extending reverse mortgages. So, for people with senior citizens, especially because senior citizens are able to access, who have right to ownership on getting federal guarantees and then going for reverse mortgages. But if we add people with disabilities or even testing, people with disabilities and caregivers to be part of the reverse mortgage schemes with bank, I think this testing social security and wider resources of incomes backed by the value of residential mortgage. And then even if there is an insurance to back this, I think it gives attractive terminal values, both for the banks, even secures the owner's right, even for the caregivers or the generation that has to come right after PWDs. Which in my view is another way that you can safeguard the rights of property for people with limited disabilities. I think helping developers overcoming attitudinal barriers. This this piece is actually, something we talk very often about. I don't want to talk much on this, but just that built environment and specifically, adaptive footprint, it encourages uh, what we call as, you know, so this is a mean by which we actually help in the overall development of a neighborhood. It encourages, people with wider groups to come and stay together. Uh, but overall, the occupancy is a bigger driver rather than the value of the place. So you'll find that more the occupancy, the better rates that the developer generates. And then it's been fully established that if you have built environments which are more adaptive, which are more good for people with senior age groups, you find occupancy higher, and that actually helps in attracting better rents or better rates in the overtime. So I think somewhere or the other, if the governments can allow better occupancy homes and then contribute to when the housing markets are going grow, and then contribute towards transaction charges for the developer, it actually promotes the developer to deliver for more inclusive spaces. I think one last point which I would want to add here is that we've spoken about how insurances, and largely insurances which could benefit people with disabilities, and then establishment of the National Fund for People for at the center, the National Fund for People with Disabilities. If that fund actually is able to contribute for insurances which people with disability could pay, or the caregivers could pay, or even the corporates could actually, from their collective good foundations, could actually put money around it. The developers would be encouraged to actually find them as a niche market and will make supply happen for them. But those are some things from the supply side. I'm sorry, this is largely from the supply side. We've spoken a lot about the demand side, what the demands. But from the supply side, these are the attributes that could be put together to actually promote and make markets work for people with disability. I'll take a pause here, and then very happy to take more questions from you.
Thank you, Harpreet. This was very, very interesting discussion. And very, very rightly, you mentioned that it's, very often we talk or hear about like what is, what is the demand and what are the gaps in delivering that, but nobody talks about the supply side of it. So it's kind of interesting that the actual challenges the supply side faces, because if we don't cater to them and if we don't respond to that, we cannot somewhere reach a conclusion ever. Well, thank you for this very, very detailed presentation on the real estate challenges and concerns. And I would like to take this opportunity along with my colleagues here to ask a couple of questions to better understand and sort of discuss on some aspects. So to begin with one of my questions, like rental housing, of course, it's a growing market in urban India, like especially in bigger cities like Delhi, Bangalore, Mumbai, Chennai. Despite the high demand, there's little or no availability or supply of housing solutions for persons with disability. This kind of is particularly exasperated, for as homeowners who don't want to retrofit their homes for tenants who are persons with disability, and later on, go back to the regular housing, this thing. So what do you think can be some of the innovative solutions to respond to the growing demand for inclusive housing in the space?
Thanks, Ivy. I think we've got to understand that rental housing is one means of serving in the current scenario in urban areas, specifically we talk about, is one means of delivering spaces which could be occupied either by people who can't get access to home ownerships, and then they can actually are at the point where they don't want to have longer term home ownership, and then that's why rental housing suits them. And then for people with disability to access accommodation, whether that's um, on ownership basis, or whether that's on temporary ownership, or whether that's on rental ownership, the from the perspective of the homeowners to give space to rent to people with disabilities, I think a lot of a lot of means should be done by promotion of getting them an assurance that your rents are not discounted. Uh, that's the first thing that comes to an owner, that my rents would be discounted against the investments that he does on making that space inclusive for a person who might be renting that space. I think that assurance could be done if the person who's actually accessing home uh, is backed by a national insurance or is backed by a bank to help him. That listen, I can't help you to buy a home, but there is always a way that I can help your owner to make your space inclusive for you. And then this is a discounted rent, or this is the discounted financing that I can give your homeowner to develop that space. And then and that person or that bank can actually claim for tax abatement from the national fund. So while we're trying to manufacture a lot of homes, we don't need to do that. We basically need to install a mechanism by which the space can be adjusted, and homeowners in this case can go back and claim, because they'll be assured that their rent is actually backed by the government through a tax abatement. And the banks in this case don't have to actually pull up for a lengthy mortgage. They can actually give that piece of mortgage to make the space for the homeowner, and then there could be a tripartite agreement to do that. So this is one way, and then this needs policy thinking.
Yeah.
But your point is absolutely right that rental housing is actually the space where the government should test it.
Yeah, I think you made a very strong point, because that the fact that that there is the assumption that once I give it for rent to a persons with disability and make a huge investment, I might not get the kind of returns I'm expecting, or I may the person may leave in a certain point of time. So having this kind of assurance from a certain system can actually make more tourism, and people will be more willing to sort of rent their houses out, and it can work as a much better scheme, and it can also strengthen the confidence in persons with disability to rent an apartment, and also rent an apartment for a longer duration of time, have some amount of social security in terms of having a safe and accessible and inclusive place for them to live. So yeah, it kind of caters to many aspects within that. As a follow-up, I wanted to also discuss this with you, that many cities across the globe are focusing on developing complete neighborhoods, with basic facilities within 500 to 800 meters walking distance. Within this, 10 to 15 minutes walking radius, they kind of promote a self-sustaining model where facilities such as a market, dispensary, parks and open spaces, community areas are all planned for. What do you think will facilitate development of such complete neighborhoods to be incorporated within our cities? And since most of them are very densely planned, I mean, it doesn't cater directly to persons with disability per se, but in general, if we have a facility which is much more closer by, it has a huge impact on the vulnerable population, especially on elderlies, persons with disabilities, children, their caregivers for elderly and for persons with disability. So it has a huge sort of positive impact on their everyday lives.
Thanks, Eva. Thanks for asking that question. I think very relevant. not only for the new neighborhoods, which basically would want to develop a concept where it's compact, but if we study Asian what is more mixed use development today in terms of master planning, but they were actually developed in a way where the communities stay together and the community's works are actually not too distant from the space of your accommodation. I think from the perspective of space inclusion, whether that's multiple activities put together in the same, it's very efficient way of resource planning. Yeah, whether that's for uh, services, whether that's for financing, or whether that's for even for people to access those services. So I do agree with your point that having compact spaces and walkability to these spaces where you don't have to, and this can be done even for existing spaces, which are not new neighborhoods, but actually old neighborhoods which could be retrofitted. And that's exactly what we could do on identifying uh, at a master plan scale, at least, by this whole term of actually not delivering the land use because the market needs it, but identifying land uses based upon the communities around it. And then I think from from my perspective, we found those examples very much in the last 1.5 years, when we found some neighborhoods really lacking healthcare facilities at a community level, and some neighborhoods are having a surplus of those health facilities at a community level. So, in a block by 2 kilometers by 2 kilometers, you really find some neighborhoods actually having access of healthcare facilities. But on the contrary, I think promoting inclusion and ensuring that we are packing more in the same neighborhood is an endeavor that could be delivered first at the master plan scale, because if you envision that, you can only then deliver that at a scale at a plot level, because you can't look at these scales from perspective of a developer. You can only do this when you are a policymaker, when you're sitting and drafting these master plans, when you're sitting and making policy decisions on what scale of land use needs to be altered. So I think these considerations are very critical at that time. Because if you think from a developer's perspective, he can't deliver everything on his own. He could only deliver as much as he's been funded for. And I think the space where we live, modern neighborhoods, whether that's the suburbs of Delhi, whether that's Gurgaon or Noida, sharing access between two neighborhoods, whether that's a 50-acre site by one developer, a 50-acre site by another developer, a 20-acre site by a smaller developer. Sharing access between these is something that we found in my real estate career. One of the biggest bottleneck where each developer is trying to replicate what best that he would want to do in this neighborhood. But actually, if you share access between these three neighborhoods, you might not need to do all this. And that's where I think this whole licensing scheme, this whole categorization of what each development of 50 acres should look like. So every developer is just trying to do the same thing. But if actually they share access, they might not have to do the same thing. They can actually share these services as well. So your point well taken on it. But my suggestion this would be that this should be looked up a scale a little bigger than that, and then promoting these neighborhoods should be done intelligently, so they are actually sharing those neighborhoods among themselves. They are not gated and they don't share them. So short answer is that at a policy scale, and then delivery should be actually on open access.
I agree with you on that. And I think as a follow-up, I want to kind of ask a follow-up question to the same, and to the point that you very interestingly made, is that what do you think could be some of the innovative ways in which cities themselves can participate and contribute towards achieving there's an inclusive planning and become an active participants towards responding, to this demand?
Well, I'll try and answer this question on my best judgment. I think at least for the Indian context, Divya, we all know that we lack uh, we lack good baseline data, and then most of the Indian cities they lack baseline data, and then promoting evidence-based planning would come and we have real-time data. And that, in my view, is something the cities should really rely now on use of technology, whether that's spatial technology or whether that's even uh, using other means of accessing service, and then moving away from what we've been doing in the past about 50 to 60 years, this approach of setting up a land use plan for the next 20 years, and then predicting what the next 20 years could be done by coloring the sheet today. It has to be more adaptive. And I think that would be done when there's a regular interaction between both the citizens, the businesses, the entrepreneurs, and then this could be done. We've seen that you guys were part of it as well when the country actually put up the first challenge fund for the smart city mission. It isn't difficult. So I think what we're missing is the capacity building again, at the city scale, and then using that space where interaction between the communities, interaction between the citizens could be done. So one, data collection, ensuring we've got the right data when we plan for it. Second is interaction with them. And in my view, the third piece, which is more important, is just testing new models of finance, not hesitating in them, even if we can't do that on scale. And then that should be done at least uh, by the private sector, because the public sector is taxpayers' money. You can't go on testing new models. But the private sector should actually be allowed to test new financing models, at least for the areas which are underserved. Some of them that we've highlighted could be rental housing or even commercial lending for people with disabilities or even aged population would want to contribute to the economy. So helping them in accessing finance. So promoting, I would say, competitive financing federalism for people who would want to do it and who pays, and especially for areas where financing is not allowed. And that's where I think actors like previously through our debt gap portfolio in FCDO, we've helped in testing these models. So these are largely 3 or 4 high level areas which could promote cities and encouraging thinking which is beyond beyond just mass planning approach, but actually at the approach at which communities can participate and decide on what they would want is an approach that we found very successful in the Netherlands or in the UK. There's a huge amount of trust that's been built up, which we see there's a lack of trust between the law enforcers and also the citizens within Indian context for the cities. I think that should be built up.
Yeah. I think very, very interesting and very, very valid points. And all of these points we can actually test within Indian cities. So these are very doable points as well. Another aspect I wanted to discuss with you was about planning norms. Um, we understand that they need constant reforms and reassessment. They also need to be updated with the growing needs and demands and changes in order to ensure that they are still responding to and take into account the needs of all citizens, and how how do you think they can be better planned and executed in order to ensure that they make the housing market more comprehensive and in alignment and in responsive to the requirements of all citizens? To some extent, you have addressed this point in your presentation as well, where you discuss that harmonized guidelines need to be better sort of accommodating, and also models of financing that can be tested, and community engagement. But I also want to hear from you. Do you think there are other things that we can do, or there are other ways to sort of accommodate this?
I think, yeah, you're absolutely right. At least on the so we basically don't realize that these are norms and guidelines, but we just make them as rules. So uh, I think promoting promoting innovations around these guidelines could be only done if they don't. uh, For example, now, there is a cost to go and do something different from the existing norms and guidelines, and then that cost could be huge. But I think from my perspective, so today, if I would want to not use full FSI, but I would want to use a minimum FSI, uh, and I would want to do different land use than the one that's prescribed. Uh, there's a lot of attraction of scrutiny around it. But if there is an output statement which basically says that it is serving a purpose, which has been missed out in the larger schemes of the master plan, but the master plan still has another 5 or 6 years of revision to be done. I think that part of allowing testing should be allowed. Uh, that's one thing, and I think progressive norms and regulations are only made uh, to adjust for the demand. And considering an Indian context where we are going to get more urbanized over the time, the demand is actually going to be reaching before we even have the supply. Mm. So, in my views, there should be areas within the ambit of urban spaces where there's free testing of what could be future demand should be adjusted. And some of these areas are, tomorrow, if you would want to have the, so for instance, today, the retrofitting areas for the Olympic Stadium in the UK serves as the best housing market for people with disability. Nobody thought about it, but because those spaces are actually designed for Paralympians. But now it's actually one of the best space to go and access market for people with disability. But this just happened because somebody tested it, and this flexibility should be allowed to some developers who can't state what they would want to develop, but at least the state of interest is elaborated in it. So I think this whole testing mechanism should be allowed, and then norms and guidelines would actually form shape when they see what is it being delivered from.
Yeah, you're very right. I mean, we need to build that scope for testing and figuring out newer methods to get this supply on board. So, as a last question, you have shared a lot of these points already. However, from your experience and work, uh, can you share some good practices and highlight some key learnings that were sort of critical for incorporating the housing needs for persons with disabilities, and how were they best addressed?
I think just going back to a couple of questions before that only, I think they are not done separately. You're absolutely right when you said that planning neighborhoods which are accessible, planning neighborhoods which are complete, and then helping people to design for neighborhoods which are complete, whether that's developers, whether that's finances. promoting that idea on inclusivity and assuring that inclusivity actually are better gains that you make today in your design, in your approach, in your selection of materials, and even accessing finance, putting finance so that your consumers can access those finance to live in those spaces is one of the best practices that I think I have found. So taking the longer time to think on what inclusive space design would be, and then there are some very good examples that we see discreetly being delivered in neighborhoods. And then there are also some very good examples where actually developers have come back and said that we probably would want to have inclusion ideas because that makes our space more attracting better renters, attracting better communities. And then we've seen the airport district next to the New Delhi new airport, which is now being set again. And then also, space now attracts better rental because suddenly we find lesser cars traveling between two buildings, and it's more accessible between two buildings, safer to go around. So these are some of the examples. I'm just giving back the same answer, but these are again the same ways that we could promote and deliver inclusive spaces.
I hear you, and I think there's just so much scope in this area that and so much testing that we require to do, and we need to kind of come together and research on these that it's like it leaves a lot of us with very interesting points that we can kind of explore. There's a lot of scope here. Well, on that note, thank you, Harpreet, for this really wonderful presentation and your inputs on this very pertinent subject, and suggesting some really interesting and challenging areas to explore as we move along in the sector. And on behalf of Basic Team and NIUA, I would like to thank you, Mr. Arora, for this great session. As always, it's always wonderful to hear from you, and it was a great pleasure to listen to your thoughts and realize the ever increasing significance of inclusion within the real estate market. Before we close the session, I would just like to remind our audience that the lecture is part of an 8-part lecture series and can be easily accessed on the National Urban Learning Platform and NIUA's YouTube page. So the link for both will be in the description box below. Thank you.